Welcome to today's event, one of a series in the Provost Forums on Public Education and the Social Good. We're very pleased to be back here in our second season of the Provost Forums, building upon our successes last year. This afternoon, we're delighted to have as our featured speaker Professor Ann Stevens, Chair of the UC Davis Department of Economics and Director of the University's Center for Poverty Research. We're equally delighted that the second part of our program will feature a panel of UC Davis students. There are at least three distinct reasons why I'm personally excited by today's forum. First, Professor Stevens' topic, Access and Affordability, a student and faculty perspective, goes to the very heart of the larger conversation and urgent concerns about the public university. In this respect, it nicely follows our last forum, in which Stanford Professor Caroline Hawksby spoke on the topic of opportunity, meritocracy, and access to higher education. But today's presentation will be of special interest to this group as it will focus in a rigorous way on the realities of educational access and affordability at our own university. The second reason I'm so excited by today's forum is that it will provide an excellent way for the fruits of another campus initiative addressing the public university to enter the larger public conversation. In the spring of 2012, I invited Professor Stevens to chair a new UC Davis study group on accessibility and affordability. The group was designed to provide us with the sort of close look at accessibility and affordability at UC Davis that is absolutely critical if we're to achieve clarity on this topic. Today, Professor Stevens will give us an advanced view of the findings of three reports that her group is currently finalizing. And the third reason I'm so excited is that today's event will include a panel of UC Davis students. To be sure, the perspective our students have inspired and informed the Provost Forums from the beginning, but there's nothing like hearing from students directly, communicating what's important to them in their own voices. Today's lecture will be followed by 7 more during the balance of this academic year. In the coming months, distinguished guest speakers will address a variety of subjects related to public higher education from a variety of perspectives. Those subjects will include accessibility and affordability again, economic conditions, legal issues pertaining to intellectual property, scientific research, the value and role of the humanities, the public university's contributions to regional development, and campus diversity. Fittingly, our final forum of this season will again feature UC Davis students. 2 undergraduate teams from the Davis Honors Challenge program will present their new research on UC Davis's students' views pertaining to the topic, the public university and the social good. I hope that all of you will be able to attend many of these lectures, if not all. If you do miss one, videos of all events, along with other materials, will be easily accessible on my website. Before going on, I want to make some very heartfelt thanks. First to the Provost Forums Organizing Committee for doing such an excellent job of planning and arranging all of our events, both this year and last. My office's co-sponsors for the series, the Study Group on Accessibility and Affordability, the Community and Regional Development Program, the Center for Poverty Research, and the Center for Regional Change. Professor Heather Rose of the Department of Education, the School of Education, and the Study Group on Accessibility and Affordability for moderating today's forum. And finally, Professor Stevens and our UC Davis student panelists for speaking with us today. Let me conclude with just a few words of context. The Provost Forums on the Public University and the Social Good grew out of conversations I had with faculty and students in the fall and winter of 2011-12. As all of you will remember, this was a period of great turmoil at UC Davis, and understandably so. Clearly, our campus community and the larger public urgently needed to embark upon a more inclusive, more informed, and more productive dialogue on what public universities should and can be in the 21st century. Today, our campus is somewhat calmer than it was 2 years ago, in part because we've made significant progress in addressing the financial burdens on students, but not enough. This burden is still too large for too many of our students. Just as importantly, the chief cause of our present crisis, the unprecedented public disinvestment in higher education is still with us, still constraining us, and still taking its toll on our teaching and research programs. The Provost Forum has then two goals. The first is to increase our knowledge and understanding of the issues that are both complex and often obscured by passion and the heat of ideological or partisan debate. And the second goal is to enrich and help to advance the larger campus and public dialogue on this topic. All Californians, indeed all Americans, have a vital interest in public higher education, given the important role it plays in improving society and individual lives. If we widely disseminate the sort of scholarly and expert exchange fostered by this series, we stand a better chance of creating a 21st century public university that will continue to work miracles for the benefit of all for generations to come. So I thank you all for being in our audience today, and I will now turn the podium over to School of Education Professor Heather Rose. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm, like he said, Heather Rose, a professor of education policy here at the UC Davis School of Education. First, I'd really like to thank Provost Textor for promoting these forums on the public university and social good. This series, I think, has been incredibly informative and valuable for both my professional and personal thoughts on these subjects. I would also like to extend all of my thanks for you all for coming today. I'm really looking forward to hearing a variety of perspectives from our panelists and audience members. Finally, I'm really happy to be introducing Professor Ann Stevens to you, and not just because it turns out we went to the same small elementary school in a small town in Texas many years ago, but I'm really happy to be introducing her for all that she's done for our university. Professor Stevens wears many hats around here. She's been a professor in the economics department for the last 10 years and is currently chairing that department. On top of that, she's the director of the UC Davis Center for Poverty Research, which has hosted many conferences in this very room. What I find particularly neat about that program is that in proposing and earning the grant for that center, she really emphasized the important role that education plays in our country's social safety net. And that theme of the importance of education really carries over into other work she's done for the university and its students as well. In 2012, Professor Stevens took on the important role of chairing the UC Davis Study Group on Access and Affordability. I've served on that committee with her, and I really appreciate her commitment to better understanding the challenges that students are facing in their attempts to earn a college degree, and to better understand the challenges the university is facing to provide for its students in light of these recent budget cuts especially. So I'm really happy that she has the opportunity to present some of the committee's work today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Ann Stevens.
Thanks very much, Heather and Provost Textor. So it's very nice to be here today, and I have to say I often speak to large groups of people. I'm teaching Econ 1 this quarter, so the crowd is not quite that large, but that's probably, maybe a good thing. But it's especially nice to see this crowd because it's so diverse in terms of the roles of different people at the university. We have administrators, we have students, we have some of my faculty colleagues. And I think that sort of gathering does not probably happen enough. And I think the things we're going to talk about here today, it's really important that all of us have this shared understanding of some of these points. So welcome and thank all of you for coming. So what I want to do today is I want to take about half an hour to share with you, as was indicated, some of the findings of the study group, and I also want to, of course, thank the members of the study group, and I will have their names for you at the end of the talk for you to admire and thank. But I do think, it's been phrased on the flyers and what I just said as the findings of the group. I actually think that might be a little bit of an overstatement, because I think one of the main things the group emphasized to me and to all of us is that there's a lot of information that is not exactly, it doesn't need to be uncovered, but it needs to be disseminated. And I think when I thought about this talk and what I was going to say and who would be here, I think it's safe to say that everyone in the room will already know some of what I say, but I doubt that very many people will know all of what I say. And so I think getting us all to have this shared knowledge is really important, and I'm really happy to try to do that today. So I'm going to talk really about three main points, or three areas we focused on. One is this general area of affordability. and look at that a couple of different ways. The second is the role of loans in working with and supporting that affordability, and then talk a little bit about what is the return to a UC Davis and a college education in general, and just emphasize some facts about those as we see them. Okay. So to talk about the affordability of a college education, it's a little bit, to think about what a college education cost is a little bit, I think, like thinking about what a seat on an airplane cost. And by that I mean, if you're sitting in an airplane and you have paid $500 for your seat, you should have no confidence that the guy sitting next to you has paid $500. He or she may have paid $200 or $1,000, or we really don't know. So in higher education, there's an even more sort of complicated issue, which is that everyone does not, in fact, pay the same amount for the same education at the same institution. And so what I'm going to talk about a lot today is this concept of net cost, which is just a way of calculating at the individual level, what does an individual person pay in total to attend a year at the university. And this is going to be, very simply, the total cost of attendance, or some of you may think of it as the total student budget for a year, minus grant and scholarship aid that is received. And because in this country, in this state, and at this institution, we believe in the need to provide access to education, but all of these levels of government and the institution of UC Davis provide grants and scholarships, and many of them, if not all of them, are based to some extent on family income. So we have to think a little bit about the family income of students as we talk about what the education cost. And also, just a note, as the economist, all of these trends and things I'm going to show are already adjusted for inflation, so they're in real terms. So I think the important picture that we all have a fuzzy version of in our head is here. And this is net cost for students coming from families with different levels of income. And for each level of income along the bottom, from under $25,000 all the way up to families earning $150,000 or more, there are two bars here. The blue one is the 2001 value, and the yellow one, or gold, the colors aren't quite UC Davis colors, but I tried. My 13-year-old daughter suggested this color scheme to me, by the way. I've got to give her a plug. The yellow bars are what those net costs looked like 10 years later, 2010-11. And so the overall picture, I think we all know, net costs have gone up. But what is important here is that the extent of the increase varies dramatically across the income spectrum. And so the university, along with federal assistance, state assistance, has been able to protect, in some sense, the lowest income students from a lot of the total tuition increases and cost increases that we've seen. And so that's just shown by the fact that at the one end, families earning very little, those students have faced net costs that over this 10, 11-year period are relatively flat. What I don't show is that this cost for the lowest income students actually went up a bit in the middle of this period and then came back down as we adjusted our aid policies to reflect the rising cost. What this also shows, though, just as importantly, is that for middle income and higher income families, there have been very steep increases in net cost. And so the issue of what has happened to affordability, what's the trend, very much depends on the family backgrounds of the particular students and the costs they're facing. So just to summarize, small or no increases for the lowest, for the very low or slightly low income students, and then you start to see much larger increases over the last decade for middle and higher income students. Okay. So then, before moving away from this and looking at cost in a different way, it's also worth pointing out, as Provost Hexter did, you might wonder, well, why do we see these dramatically rising costs? And there are a few answers, but there's one main one, and that is that the state is giving less money per student to UCs in general and UC Davis. And so in 2001, state general funds per student were about $15,000. 2011, that was under $7,000. And so the difference has to be made up somehow. The president of the US has talked about this. Many people talk about, well, universities have to cut costs. We can cut costs to an extent, but I don't think we can cut cost of this magnitude. And so part of what's gone on here is just a response, a necessary response to this increase or decrease in state funding. So that's sort of the first picture I want us all to have in our head about trends over time. The other question, though, is not so much about trends over time, but thinking about affordability at a point in time and the point we are now and what that looks like. And again, of course, it depends on, well, affordability is always a matter of, sort of in the eye of the beholder. But it also, of course, depends on your family background, family, and your own resources. But also, I think we like to compare it to other comparable or similar universities. And so one thing the study group tried to do was to go out, and this is a very non-scientifically selected group of peer institutions or comparable institutions, other public research institutions. And what's good for any consumer of higher education to know is that universities are now more or less required to have a website or a way for students to see what their net cost is likely to be. And so what my excellent research assistant on this project did was to go to these net cost calculators for a number of different universities, enter parental income at a relatively low level, a higher level, and then still a higher level, and see what the net cost looked like. So the first column is focusing on the lowest income students, as I was mentioning before, and you see that UC Davis here has a net cost for the characteristics we entered of around $10,000 for the lowest income students. So, this is, I think, if the lack of increase in net cost for low-income students was the good news, this number might be, I think, a bit of bad news. That's a fairly steep price tag, I think, when total family income is only about $25,000. The other thing I want to highlight here is that the range of net cost for seemingly similar universities is really all over the place. And in particular, this cost is quite high relative to places like University of Virginia, University of North Carolina, who have, because of both their stated tuition and their aid policies, keep costs for the lowest income students quite low. And we're going to come back to this point. But on the other hand, there are many other public universities where costs are comparable. Okay, so that's the first sort of takeaway from here. If you look at more middle income students, students in this simulation from a family with $80,000, of course their net costs are higher, as we saw in the previous graph. Here are the comparisons. Again, this isn't exactly a random sample, nor is it a very large sample of peer institutions. But you see, for the more middle income students, we are a little more in the middle of the pack here, and no one is so dramatically below UC Davis for this middle income group. And similarly, we look sort of similar in terms of relative comparisons of these different schools if you go to even higher levels of family income. The final column here sort of doesn't belong on this graph. It's a very different number, but it's really important to understanding the relationship between the first column and the second column here. And that is, so Pell Grants, as hopefully many of you know, are federal educational grants that go to relatively low-income families to try to promote access and affordability. And most families receiving Pell Grants have family income of under $40,000, okay? The notable thing here is that UC Davis, and all of the UCs really, have an incredibly sort of dramatic characteristic, which is that they serve very large fractions of these lower income students, which is just proxied by the fraction of our undergraduates with Pell Grants. And the reason this is important as we think about affordability at other places is that, so if you look, for example, at the University of Virginia as an example, it's absolutely true that for their lowest income students, they keep net cost very, very low. It's also true, however, that they serve relatively few of those students. And this is important, and this is not to knock Virginia. My good friend Sarah Turner, who's the chair of the economics department there, was here. It's just a fact. It has to do with the demographics of the state, the history of where students go in the state for higher education. And the fact is that it's easier to keep net costs low if you don't have for low-income students, if you don't have very many of them. It's more affordable. And this is something that I think the UC's real advantage and strength in providing access for low-income students. This issue comes up now as we're in this era of rising cost and reduced state support, that if we want to maintain that, it is a bigger challenge given our history and pattern of serving a lot of those students. Okay, so this, and so I've sort of tried to set up this idea that there's this really important relationship between essentially what the net costs are for the lowest income students and what they are for more middle income students. And this graph, which is has a lot of colors and a lot going on, really tries to emphasize that point as well. And let me, at this point, I may need to figure out how to turn on the laser pointer. Oh, excellent, okay. So this is one graph out of sort of one part of our report, and this is focusing on what I call middle income students, and this is data for freshmen admits to UC Davis, not students who necessarily came to Davis, but the freshmen admitted. On top of the bar chart, I've just put, this is the net cost line over time for all students lumped together. So if I added up all those yellow and gold, blue bars, you see here it increased a lot. The early part of the decade leveled out, and then we had this recent increase. And the reason this line is here is because we want to look at this line with the rest of the graph. What the rest of the graph is showing is where students who were admitted to UC Davis chose to enroll. So the Office of Admissions was very helpful in the Office of Financial Aid in getting us these data. And what we want to think about is, if I've told you that we serve a lot of low-income students at UC Davis, well, how do we have the resources to provide financial aid to those students? Part of it is from state funds, but increasingly part of it is from the tuition that middle and higher income students pay. And so if you are a middle income student or family, you obviously care about net cost at UC Davis. But in some sense, if you are a low-income student or family, or if you want to keep access for those families, you also better care about what we're charging middle and higher income families, because there's this important link. And what we tried to look at here, so these bottom graphs are showing, well, where do people go if they're admitted to UC Davis? And so the yellow bars are really the ones you should focus on. What the yellow bars are the fraction of UC students admitted to UC Davis who actually go to colleges out of state instead of coming here. And then the other bars break them into out of California public and private, but we'll just focus on the yellow bars. And what's a little bit alarming here is that you see a clear upward trend in the number of students who are admitted here but go out of state. And so what that suggests to my economist brain, at least, is that there might be, part of this might be a response to the rising cost. And I think if you look, in particular, when we had these sharply rising costs early on, we call this in economics eyeball econometrics. It's not, there are no journals that publish these sorts of results, but we practice it all the time. So when this goes up, you do start to see this increase. And then here we have a flat, a more subtle increase, but you see this dramatic rise. And lots of things are going on here, but I think the view, we talked about this graph in the study group quite a bit, and I think what this suggests is really that we do want to, as an institution, think very carefully about at what point net costs get high enough for middle income and higher income students that they vote with their feet and go somewhere else, because this directly impacts our ability to provide access to lower income students. And so that's sort of the story here from this very colorful graph. Okay, so now I want to say a few words about student loans, which have been one of my sort of, it's sort of not so much as an economist, but as a citizen, I've followed the media coverage of student loans quite carefully. And honestly, it often has me screaming at the New York Times in the morning, because I think the media coverage of this has not been, frankly, very accurate. So what do I mean by that? Well, so first, to just connect this to my previous comments about affordability. So when I say that the lowest income students have a net cost of around $10,000, some of that, how do they cover that? Well, some of that is covered by student loans. So in these net cost figures, we don't count loans that the students might be eligible for, because that's not a grant or a scholarship. So if you read the newspaper or Time magazine, you may have the impression that the typical student loan borrower has gotten themselves into a tremendous mess, will never be able to pay back the loans. So of course we want to look at that with respect to the UC Davis population. So what do we know? Some basic facts. Currently, a little more than half of our undergraduate students graduate with student loan debt. that number is absolutely rising over time. So a few years ago, it was well under half. So that's one thing that we want to keep an eye on. The average level of debt, so once students graduate with a bachelor's degree, the average level of debt among those who borrowed was about $17,000. To some, this may sound like a very large number, to others not, but I'm going to have a way to sort of think about what this means in just a minute. And a lot of the media coverage has been about students who borrow extraordinary amounts of money. So students who finish their BA $120,000 in debt or $80,000 in debt. And so we also want to think about that upper tail. So how many UC Davis students graduate with a lot of debt? So here I have not such an extreme amount. About 18% of our graduates have debt in excess of $25,000. I believe it's less than 2% have debt in excess of $50,000. So if you were looking for a UC Davis student in the, I think, the media profile of student borrowers, it would be very hard to find one because our students are not borrowing that much. And that's true generally of students at four-year nonprofit public universities. But important to keep these levels in mind. So I want to say a little bit about so take this average level of debt around $17,000, even up to $20,000. We should think about what that means and whether that's cause for a lot of concern. I'm going to sort of argue that perhaps that's not really cause for concern and perhaps that's a good investment. I often go back and think about my own student debt levels when I finished undergraduate and adjusted for inflation. They were right in this ballpark, and I have managed to pay them off and with some good luck and great employers like this university. So that's one way to think of it, is in real terms, this hasn't increased dramatically over the course of a few decades, as Heather was referring to our elementary school long ago. But the way to really think about it, and here is where I'm really happy to have an audience of students, because I think the way we want to think about this debt level is to think about what does that mean? How much are you going to have to pay back per month relative to what you're likely to be earning? And so we've also done some of these calculations among some of the study group reports. And so what does this mean for repayment? And so here I have three hypothetical levels of borrowing centered around that average of about $17,000. So a student who borrows $10,000, this is, again, the internet is a wonderful thing, as we all know, but if you have a student loan balance in mind, or perhaps in reality what you've currently borrowed, in about 10 seconds you can Google student loan calculator, and it will tell you when you graduate what is your monthly payment going to be. And every student here who has a student loan needs to know this. They need to know what repayment they're in line for. If you look at it, so look at the $20,000. So if you graduate with $20,000 in loans and you enter the standard federal repayment, which is basically repayment over 10 years, I think we used an interest rate of 6% in these calculations that Congress was sort of fighting about what the interest rates would be. You get a monthly payment of $230. Well, whether or not that's affordable, of course, depends on your income, and I'm going to talk about that next. But there are also other options. One is that many loans qualify for what's called a graduated repayment plan. So if you get out and realize that my income at age 24 may not be the highest level it's ever going to be in my life, maybe I want to change these loan repayments so I pay a little less now and more when I'm older. You can get this graduated repayment. So their payments might start at about $158. And then if you are really low income, if you have income in this case below $20,000, you can get the payment lowered further. Also, there are contingencies if you're unemployed and looking for work but not employed. And so I think these sort of put this loan burden in a bit of perspective and show that for a typical college graduate, a repayment of $150 to $230 or a little more per month is probably pretty reasonable. Probably many of you have car payments that may be in this neighborhood, perhaps. Do I see students nodding? Yeah. So I think, I've in the past looked up average amounts that people borrow for their weddings is quite extraordinary and much higher than these. And my husband is actually in the audience, so I'm not going to say, oh, your wedding isn't important. But, college education does have financial returns over your lifetime. So that's, I don't want to diss the wedding here in this crowd. Okay. So the final question that, again, has come up in the media all the time and caused me, in fact, for a while, through some random checking the wrong box, my household started to receive, before it went out of business, Newsweek magazine. And I would get it and leave it in the kitchen for a few days before we recycled it, to be honest. But then one day they had this issue that said, the headline was, "Why College No Longer Pays." And that was a turning point in which I then would take the magazine directly from the mailbox and put it into the recycling bin. And then a few weeks later, I woke up and NPR announced that morning that Newsweek was no longer publishing, and I was happy, but that's... Okay, so why does this get me upset? Well, because it's simply not true. So we've also thought a bit, so that's just my reminder. All of you student borrowers, tonight, Google student loan repayment calculator and figure out what you will owe. And you'll probably be relieved, I would guess, for most of you. Okay, so then we have to think about, is this degree that we may be borrowing for, paying increasing amounts of money for, is it worth it? The answer is yes, despite what Newsweek may say. So here, what we did is we tried to get some estimates of what recent young UCD graduates earn. And there are two ways we did this. One is that the university does do surveys of graduates and ask them, what are you earning? You get a number from those surveys approximately in the neighborhood of 40,000. As an empirical economist, I worry a lot about those surveys because the response rates tend to be low. And there's a concern that if you've gotten out of school and gotten a really great job, you're going to be more enthusiastic about filling out that survey and sending it in. So we also went to some large national data sets, and fortunately we live in a very large state, so we can look only at California, look at relatively young people, I think 25 to 28, who've earned only a college BA, and there you also get a number of around 40,000. And so we think this isn't what everyone will earn, but this is a pretty good estimate of average earnings of young college graduates. Now, a typical high school graduate with relatively low experience is going to earn about 22,000. So again, wearing my economist hat, this does not mean necessarily that college makes you that much more productive, but economists spend a lot of time arguing over whether this is just a difference between the types of people who go to college and the types who don't. And most of that literature finds, well, you might adjust it a little when you correct for this selection and people choosing to go to college. But for the most part, we think these are pretty close to the actual effects of going to college and completing a degree. So final picture to show you here, and this is a great picture that my colleague, Professor Rose, prepared. So this is based mainly on those surveys of recent UC Davis graduates in terms of what they earn. And so 3 lines that aren't blue here, I don't know how well, I guess the light blue is not showing up so great, but so the top line is just that average earnings for high school people without a college degree. Then the first white line in the middle there that's that approximately 40,000 that comes from UC Davis survey data in terms of earnings, full-time employed 1 year after a bachelor's degree. And then the other white line is from that other data source, California with a bachelor's degree, age 25 to 28. And then around it, there's variation by major. Right? So it's true that some majors pay less than others, and some occupations pay less than others, but still you see that even sort of the lowest paid occupations for recent graduates are doing substantially better than a high school graduate. Another picture I don't have here, but is worth emphasizing, is this is sort of the comparison for a single year, right? And you see how much higher those with a college degree are. But of course, these returns to your college education accumulate over your lifetime. If you do some of those calculations, it's not a close call, right? It's not about what assumptions did the economists make, what interest rate are we using, how much of the effect is causal. There's a pretty, it's pretty hard to dispute that the return to a college education remains very high, has been high and remains very high. Other. I predicted. I actually tried, I will be honest, I tried to remove the other because I knew someone would ask, and the answer is I don't know. I believe it is other small majors or people who didn't report their major. But you're right, everyone should major in other, according to this, exactly. So, yeah, sure.
The other question is, for the high school
I think we took a sort of comparable range to the 25 to 28, but backed it up since they start early. So I think it's something like high school only 20 to 24. So it's young, just as the college numbers are, but it's a narrow age range. Yeah. Sure.
When you compare these high school students with a bachelor's degree holders, do you have numbers on the salaries of people who went into technical trade? Let's say you went and became a plumbing or mechanic, 1 year technical training where they are highly in demand and highly people are getting
that's a great question for two reasons. One, because it's really important to understand. You're talking about majors and fields that might not be reflected in traditional four-year college majors. I don't have that information as part of this study, but the other reason it's a great question is because I have a big research project with my colleague Mikal Kurlander in the School of Education that's focusing on that question of returns to vocational programs in the U.S., which we know very little about, but we're working on. So we'll get that done in the next few years, hopefully. All right. So I've gotten to my end of my half hour, and I really want to hear from the students and then allow some time for questions. So this is just a summary. I'm not going to repeat it all, but these are what I think of as the takeaway messages here. And then again, finally, I want to thank all of the members of the study group and the various offices that helped us pull this data together. And I look forward to hearing from the students and then having some questions from you. Thanks. Going to put that back up.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Stevens. My name is Carissa Lowe. I am the Chief of Staff to President Carly Sandstrom of ASUCD. So now I'd like to introduce our student panel, who we are very lucky to have today to share some of their experiences and stories concerning these issues. So first, we have Harley Litzelman. He's a first-year sociology and communications double major. He's the current legislative aide of Lobby Corps, in which he lobbies on behalf of students regarding measures affecting higher education at the Capitol in Sacramento. Next, we have Felicia Autumn. She's a third-year political science and communications double major. She's a first-generation college student and a former senator of ASUCD. And during her term, she worked a lot with accessing higher education and dealing with the fee hikes and what our students thought about that. Third, we have Linda Plutino. She's a fourth-year economics major. She's actually a transfer student here, and she does a lot of research in which she looks at numbers that Professor Stevens looked at too in accessing higher education and the increasing cost of higher education. And then we have Didi Okwalagu. She's a third-year African American Studies and a political science double major. She's currently the president of the Black Student Union, and during her work there, she reaches out to a lot of high school students, trying to get them interested in going to college. And she sees a lot of instances in which a lot of high school students don't see college as an option anymore because of the increasing cost. So I'm very excited to hear from all of you. So Harley, could you start?
So again, my name is Harley Litzman, first year sociology and communications double major, and I'm planning to minor in education, as well as legislative aide for ASUCD Lobby Corps, as she described. And I'm also an intern for ASUCD Senator Garrett Smythe. I grew up in Fremont, California, at the northern edge of Silicon Valley. My mother is a waste management contractor, and my father's a private security advisor. And the reason I'm here is because California made the decision to invest in my education. I grew up in a comfortable home with many advantages, but even so, a 21st century higher education in California was only an option because of financial aid, merit, and need-based. Regarding my personal perceptions on the overall state of affordability and accessibility, in my work with Lobby Corps, I've become something of a student of the California Master Plan, and I've been studying the revisions and the reports that have followed the original Master Plan. So just for a quick overview, 1960, governor and legislature commissioned for a massive plan to kind of unite the purpose of California higher education publicly and private higher education. So in a report that followed in 1973, the Joint Committee on the Master Plan for Higher Education made a lot of interesting and astute observations that are still applicable today. And it's quite a piece of like educational philosophy and strategy and so forth. But then it says this, quote, "The master plan concept is no longer useful." Okay, so wait a minute. 13 years after one of the greatest commitments in higher education history, alongside GI Bill, alongside Morrill Land Grant College, one of the greatest commitments ever, 13 years after they said it wasn't working. And I wanted to think that this was just like kind of like one cynical article talking, but if you look at the history proceeding after that report, that's what happened. The narrative shifted to find justifications for, let me back up. The master plan says college should be free. Okay, with that in mind. The narrative then shifted to find justifications for increasing tuition and fees. You find reports that say, oh, the regents that govern the UCs have constitutional autonomy and can do what they want. Or there's legislative control over the CSU tuition. Or the master plan itself directly says that you can charge certain ancillary fees as needed. So the history follows like Governor Reagan's moral war against higher education, and calling UC Berkeley this like throbbing sex pit of communism and recycling. And following that, you have like passage of Prop 13, Prop 98, three strikes law, prison construction, recession of 1990, dot-com boom, Great Recession. All of these challenges managed to make higher education less of a priority, giving college students a smaller slice of the pie and making them bake their own. So Michael Shires describes the recession of 1990 as a turning point at which the segments no longer had the ability to look at their enrollment projections and say to the state legislature, this is what we want to pay. This is the money we want from you. The tables turned, and now when the state was done paying all of its other bills, it decided how much it had left over the leftovers for higher education. So, and then even then, it took double-digit percentage in tuition came when tidal wave 2 of students crashed and all the baby boomers kids started going to college. So what does that mean for access and affordability? The 1973 report offers this apparently rational mentality that would say, no, we shouldn't judge decisions based on this one single plan that we wrote a long time ago. It should be a continuous reassessment. That sounds all fun and good, but that idea deleted the moral constitution that the master plan provided. That using continuous reassessment of higher education policy, what that does is continuously reassess your values, turning tuition into something that really shouldn't happen, according to 1960 master plan, into a managed enrollment strategy. And continuous reassessment of higher education policy should seek the preservation of the commitments made in the master plan in the face of new challenges. We cannot reassess our values every time we are faced with new challenges. So how do I fit into all of this? I'm one of the few people in my family to make it to four-year college. I qualify for the Blue and Gold Opportunity Plan, Pell Grant. I'm receiving merit scholarships from College of Letters and Science and ASUCD. And I currently don't need to take loans out just because of the nice upfront package they get me to enroll. Who knows what's happening in a few years. But my family's getting older. I have parents that need medical assistance. I have grandparents that need medical assistance. And this all fits into a society in which there are such high stakes pinned to the basic events of life, like getting an education, getting a job, getting sick, getting better. And when we don't have a state and a nation committed to the support of its citizens through these episodes of life, a less than optimal number of them will actually get through them. The cost of life cannot outweigh the benefits of living. And so what is the role and the responsibility of the university to fix this? If we're talking really practical, just upfront stuff, we can start with investing in open source alternatives to immorally expensive textbooks and other resources. I'm currently working with Senator Smythe to write a resolution urging UC Davis administration to explore numerous successful models of open textbook systems and to exploit legislative support that has already passed through Sacramento and is possibly working its way through Washington. The state also needs to establish a coordinating authority to develop policy recommendations and opportunities for intra and intersegmental cooperation. This authority needs to be balanced between the institutional expertise of the segments, but it also needs to serve the needs of the public first and foremost. The master plan tried to do this. They had the Coordinating Council for Higher Education, which failed, and then CPEC, California Post-Secondary Education Commission, which failed in 2011. Right now, the segments of California higher education is this headless monster with each limb moving in opposite directions. We need to fix that. There's a bill that's about to fail trying to do that right now, AB 1348, but we need more legislative momentum, more popular momentum to unify the segments of higher education. What else? Oh yeah, we need to work with vocational programs, as was mentioned, that we need to make sure that people that are going to college need to go to college, that what they want to do in life requires college, and that we're not allowing the speculative boom in the apparent value of college degree to outpace the actual rate at which occupations have evolved to require a college degree. That we need to make sure that isn't happening, and I suspect that it is. And then also we need to vastly improve our student retention, more so than our expansion of college access. We're actually pretty good at getting people enrolled in college or accepted to college or applying to college or whatever, but keeping kids in college. I don't care if the College Board gives out more SAT waivers, because apparently it's an $11 email to send your score somewhere. No, what I care is that you go to college, you pay for college, and you get out, and then that chart of how much more money you make, that actually applies. Because if not, then you're just a wasted risk that the state and you put into yourself for the education you apparently wanted. Part of this retention is both financial and academic, so students don't have to work graveyard shifts instead of studying and sleeping, and so students have proper access to professors, advisors, and tutors when they need them. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. As Carissa mentioned, my name is Felicia Autumn. I'm a third-year political science and communications student. I was also a former ASU City Senator. I just termed out last quarter. And a lot of my Senate term I worked on a lot of things pertaining to the California Master Plan for Higher Education, as Harley mentioned. And that's kind of what sparked my interest in this field. And similar to Harley, I also grew up in Fremont, California. I'm a first-generation college student, and both my parents are actually immigrants from Myanmar, which is now known as Burma, for people who aren't familiar. And they traveled to the U.S. in order to provide me with opportunities that they didn't really have due to the military dictatorship that's going on there. So my goal is, when I was going through high school, is like, I need to live up to the life that my parents didn't have, and that's why I'm here today. My father is currently the only one supporting my family. My mother was diagnosed with cancer when I was in the 3rd grade, and because of that, she's been unemployed, and my dad has just been the only one that's supporting us. And it's just me, my brother, my mom, and my dad. And what really got me to come to Davis was I applied to, obviously, everyone in this room. We all applied to different schools. I think I applied to like 6 UCs or something. I got accepted into, I think, a majority of them. And then I realized, I looked at the financial aid packets, and Davis actually gave me the biggest bang for my buck, is because I do qualify for the Blue and Gold Opportunity Plan. But I noticed that a lot of the other schools, like San Diego, for example, they would give me the amount in loans, and Davis gave it to me in university grants. And that was just my immediate decision. Like, I didn't have to consider 2 schools. I didn't have a choice to pick one. I was just like, Davis is the only option, because, that's the only one I could afford. So that's why I'm here today. And throughout my work in ASU City, I'll talk a little bit about that. But I've come to the conclusion that I think our state is doing an inadequate job of assuring affordability and accessibility to its students at the public level. And as Harley mentioned, the California Master Plan, it was written in 1960, and it had 3 main goals, and that was affordability, teaching quality, and accountability. And more specifically, I'm interested in the affordability aspect, which stated that California residents shall not pay tuition at the state's colleges and universities. However, such students shall pay fees to cover various operating costs, such as student services. Now, that's a little understandable. I mean, I don't think the state can pay for, like the ASUCD fee or the fee to ride Unitrans. Like, it's understandable that us as students would have to pay that, but obviously this plan is not being upheld because we're still paying tuition to this day. I had the opportunity to meet with Dr. Young from UCLA, who was one of the authors of the California Master Plan, and this was recently last quarter. And I sat him down at the SCC over there, and I asked, do you think that the California Master Plan is currently being upheld? And I was really shocked because his answer to me was yes. Like, why do you not think that? And I kind of just sat there like, well, what do I say to that? As a student, one of your main goals, I'm realizing that one of your main goals in this plan is not being upheld. I'm currently paying tuition to be here. So I think that it's clearly evident that the goal for the master plan has failed and that there should be reconsideration. I'm currently working on a Senate resolution to go through the Associated Students to urge our state government to kind of relook at the master plan and kind of see how can we further invest in our higher education. Personally, how I fit into this perception, I am currently lucky enough to be receiving some financial aid. As I mentioned, I qualify for Blue and Gold, but that doesn't really help me as much because I'm in this situation where the type of grant, the type of university grant that I receive is contingent upon if I accept other scholarships on campus. And many people may be aware of this if you received scholarships from your high school. For example, my freshman year, I reported that I received $3,000 from my high school. During the middle of the quarter, I found out that they were going to drop me from my classes if I didn't. I apparently had a $3,000 debt to the university because I reported that. Scholarship. So I'm in this really weird situation where I don't think that the university is serving me simply because I put in the effort. I've applied to department scholarships. I have 2 scholarships in the Department of Political Science, but those are completely useless for me except for the title because the money that I get from that department, I still have to repay back to the university. So because of this, aside from my role previously as a senator, I do have to work a part-time job. I work about 15 hours a week on campus. And it's got me to realize that although I think the sole responsibility should rely on our state and government or federal government, I think that our university does have somewhat of a responsibility, especially in my situation. I'm sure that there's others like me out there. And I also think that the university should hold huge responsibility with the state to raise awareness towards the fact that higher education is becoming increasingly accessible. I currently work with a lot of high school students in low-income communities to encourage global education to get them to study abroad. And obviously, we push on the message that when you go on to college, really look at studying abroad. And it's something that I've been considering, but even with the financial aid situation on campus, most students are hesitant because you don't find out how much aid you get until after you apply for the program, and it's too late to back out. So those are just my stances on higher education in terms of affordability for our school. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Linda. And just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I was actually born in Italy, but I am a U.S. citizen, so I immigrated here about 7 years ago. Prior to Davis, I actually lived in Sacramento for 5 years, where I attended community college, and I transferred here in fall 2012. My mom is actually from Central America, and she did not graduate from high school, and my dad is Italian, but he did graduate from high school, so I'm the first one in my family to go to college, and my family is pretty much what you would call low income. I've been fully supporting myself financially for the past 4 years. And before coming to UC Davis, I was working part-time as I was going to school full-time. And since I was considered low-skilled and I can only get a minimum wage job, I was actually receiving government assistance. So, well, when I came to Davis, I was actually lucky to receive the Regent Scholarship. And since at the time I was 24, which makes you financially independent from your parents, they paid for all my tuition and my living expenses. So I am fortunate where I don't have to take out any kind of loans. And I can speak to that because I have had the opportunity to get an internship in Washington, D.C. I have had an opportunity to intern at places that didn't give me any kind of compensation but can really help me in my future. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if I had to, for example, take a job. I personally don't think that the education here is very affordable, especially for low-income students. Maybe $10,000 is not that much of a burden, but when you don't have very many resources, it feels like it. And I'm interested in these issues, and they're part of my research interest as well. And I think we all know that people who come from disadvantaged backgrounds also have a harder time graduating. So, and they don't have the family resources to pay back these loans. So it goes back to maybe it's not that much if you have a job and you're an adult and you can see that were able to do it, but if you come from a low-income family, it might not feel that way for you. What else did I want to say? Also, since UC Davis has been so generous with me, they paid for my insurance, my health insurance, so I was able to see a doctor, a dentist, which hadn't happened for a very long time. I was able to stop receiving government assistance. And also, since I want to go into a public service career, this is more likely for me to happen after I graduate because I don't have to worry about getting a job in the private sector where I would make more money, but it wouldn't necessarily be what I want to do. Also, I wanted to talk about what I think the university should do. Obviously, it's not realistic that everybody gets full scholarships. I understand that. I mean, ideally, I would love for everybody to have that. But I think the school should be more transparent about, first of all, the type of majors and what kind of earnings each profession has, because maybe you'll be able to pay off your debt, but I think depending on the major, you're more likely to have a job or not, or you're more likely to have a certain type of income. And also, I know for a fact that there is a lot of people out there who prey on students who need loans, especially bankers. So I would really like to see more financial aid staff and more advisors who can help students make better decisions. Also, when we get increases in our grants, I would like for the state and the federal government to stop increasing tuition, because it sort of cancels that out. And also maybe Professor Stevens and I can have this conversation later, but I read your article, which this presentation sort of summarized, and I was curious to know what the difference in sort of the amount of loans that people get, if it varies by income, and if people who have no debt, is it coming from more grants or because they're working or from their parents, and if they're working, what type of jobs they get. And also, you talked about students having other opportunities, especially going out of state. I wonder if low-income students do have those opportunities, because if they don't, they're not going anywhere. So, thank you.
Hello, everyone. As mentioned, I'm Didi Okolagu. I am a third-year political science and African American studies double major, and I am also the president of the Black Student Union here. I grew up in Fresno, California, which is kind of a very interesting community to grow up in, because there are very privileged and very people who have a lot of advantages, but you're also in a farm working community where a lot of people are marginalized and don't have as many advantages. Growing up in that community, I saw many students my senior year having a lot of issues and having internal struggles on whether they should decide to come to college or not. And it wasn't necessarily that they had the option of going out of state because of the costs associated with out-of-state tuition, but they were really struggling with whether they should leave the city and go to UC schools when they were admitted, and they were really excited about being admitted, but they knew that there were a lot more costs associated with it. And I feel that for a lot of people in the community I grew up in, that there was you had to really take a walk of faith to decide to come to school. And you were lucky to get, your application fee through, and you get into the school, but you have this really big burden over your head of how you're going to pay for it. And what schools present to you when you first get accepted into school isn't something that makes you want to come. So I got accepted into various UC system schools, and UC Davis was one of the schools who did come and did present, their financial aid package for me very early on. And there were other schools that did present financial aid packages to me that were very few days before you had to make a decision to come to school. So in my personal opinion, I decided to go with UC Davis. Everything else about the schools didn't necessarily matter to me. The only thing that I really looked at was how much is it going to cost for me to come to school. Because I knew that this endeavor that I was trying to take would be a personal investment, and it would be something that my parents weren't able to help me invest in. And I knew that I would end up having to support myself once I came to school. So UC Davis did offer me some grants, some scholarships, but I was also asked to take out loans to cover living expenses and certain things like books. So my tuition was covered, and that for me was a blessing in itself because I didn't have to necessarily worry about fee hikes because I knew that at the end of the day, UC Davis was going to have my back tuition-wise. So I had to worry about taking care of myself and ensuring that I had the necessary materials to be successful in school. But once I got here, I did see a lot of students around me who are so worried about fee hikes. I came here in 2011, and the first thing that I experienced when I came to school was the Occupy movement and the incident out on the quad. And I really didn't know what was going on, but I had to do some research, and I understood that I wasn't necessarily being affected so much by a situation, but once I understood the full ramifications of the situation, it was very disheartening to see. My freshman year, I took a seminar with the former Vice Chancellor, Fred Wood, and we read over the master plan. And he said that, you know, we're not supposed to pay tuition, that this is supposed to be a free education. And I really had a problem with that because I didn't understand why Vice Chancellor Fred Wood was telling me something, but when I went onto my financial aid, I was paying out $13,000 in tuition. I really couldn't understand it. And as I did more and more research, it became really apparent to me that this master plan that we set out isn't serving its purpose. And in that situation, I personally felt very lied to. I felt as if that everything that the great values and the great morals that we were standing on as a university, and that everyone was trying to have equal chances and equal opportunities to access and to obtain the success that's supposed to come after college, we were kind of being lied to. And it wasn't quite what I expected. And my experience here has been very interesting because I've been in situations where financial aid, where I wouldn't be able to receive financial aid. And for me, it was a very, very real possibility that I would be withdrawing from the university because of financial circumstances or my lack of financial aid. And for any student on this campus, I would never, ever want them to experience what I went through. And I would never, and it's really disheartening to see that this happens to people, that financial aid can be ripped from your hands and you're not able to support yourself on the university in any real way. For all the students in the room, some of you may have heard of the deferred payment program. And that was an option that was given to me as a student when I was about to lose financial aid. And I read through the program guidelines and, you know, what you needed to do, and I was like, okay, you know, I got this deferred payment program, I'm gonna be fine. And I read through and it says, oh, by the first day of instruction, you should have paid two-thirds of your tuition. And I said, well, dang. How is that going to work for me? And then you're going to have another installment 30 days later. And I was like, wow, the fact that I have financial aid and the possibility that I couldn't makes the fact that we have to pay tuition a very real thing. And it makes it a very imminent thing. But for me personally, it pushes me to really succeed, and it pushes me to understand that I am making an investment and that this is a walk on faith with my education. I really think that the university should do more to help students to understand that this is an investment and understand that the university really has their back on certain things. There seems to be a feeling that the university doesn't necessarily care that they have to pay tuition. And It's as evidenced by, what everyone has said at this table today. It's just that it's not. Like, the university doesn't necessarily have your back in the way that it should in terms of tuition. I honestly feel that, students who are able to get into the UC system should really, really have their tuition and fees paid for. Living expenses is something different. I feel that students here should really have a lot more help with their tuition. And after listening to Professor Stevens in her presentation, I understood a lot of different things about our university. And something that really stuck out to me was that I come from a low-income family, and that $10,000 net cost every year is it's something very real, because I have spent time working, and I do spend time getting funds to send home to my family. And when you think about $10,000, that's what I pay to come to the university every year. But that's over the amount that my mother makes every year. That's over the income of my mother. So my mother would never be able to help me financially with school. And that $10,000, although it may seem small, it has to be made up somewhere. It has to be made up in loans or in grants or in scholarships or something. And I feel that sometimes the fact that you have to make up that money takes away from your education, because there's never been a day here that I haven't thought about, oh my goodness, I'm one more day closer to graduation. I'm one more day closer to that day I'm gonna have to start to pay back these loans. What am I doing? Oh, it's my third year. Oh, maybe I should be a bit more careful. Maybe I should take out less loans. But then I have someone who tells me, like, Dee Dee, you're really working to invest in yourself. So what I see it as, these loans and the amount of loans that you graduate with, it's about how much you believed in yourself at the end of the day. It's an investment in yourself. It's, what are you worth? Are you able to push and take out these loans and understand that it's faith and understand that it's investments, or are you scared to? And it's really, it's a really interesting dichotomy that you have, because you have to, on one hand, walk by faith, but the reason why you're walking by faith is because the system isn't helping provide for you. And I think that with the state of California, that we should really try and uphold the values and uphold the original sentiments of the master plan. And I feel that there's a lot of things that we can be doing in financial aid to help students who are in need, and to help students navigate the new financial burdens and the new financial situations that they find themselves in. Granted that UC Davis, we are starting to make plans to do a really great job with this, as evidenced by Ms. Stevens' work. But I really feel that there's a lot more that we can be doing to kind of set ourselves up for success and help other students understand that higher education is attainable and set them up for success. Because I wouldn't want the next generation to come into the university and still feel the same way I feel in regards to the master plan. And that's my personal stance on access and affordability at UC schools, specifically UC Davis. And I would like for everyone to leave here feeling that, that we do have a piece of a pie that some don't, but there's ways that we can help those who don't have that get a piece of the pie too. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our student panel. Your stories and experiences are extremely valuable, especially in a discussion like this. So now we would like to open it up to questions from the audience. We have about 20 minutes, so if you have a question, raise your hand or stand up and we'll bring a microphone over to you. So let us begin. Yeah, would you like to?
Hi, Ann. Back here. Hi. Bruce Haynes.
Sure, I guess we can all moderate. Sure.
I'm just curious, could you talk a little bit about the trends you discussed in the beginning of your presentation, and talk about how those trends might disproportionately impact historically underrepresented groups on campus in terms of their access?
Sure. Without having details, I think I can speak to it in very general terms that I think are accurate and probably what I think we would expect, and that is that groups that are underrepresented in college, higher education also tend to be disproportionately low income, is one thing. And so, you know, they are facing the net cost around $10,000 that, while, as I said, maybe they have an increase, may still be on the high side relative to some other states and options. What else to say? You know, someone on the panel talked about graduation rates. A big concern that I didn't touch on when I talked about loans is that underrepresented and first-generation students do have somewhat lower graduation rates than other groups.
I was also wondering also about sort of that middle segment of middle-class parents who might either go out of state or be kind of caught in a wedge.
Yeah, you know, we haven't looked at that in particular for groups other than the income categories, so I can't really speak to that. The last point I want to make, and then I want to see if these guys have anything to add, is just that another fact is that certainly UC Davis could improve its graduation rates, and I think we'd all like to see that. But also, one of the other provost forums by Professor Hawksby pointed out that graduation rates, especially for traditionally underrepresented groups, are vastly better at more competitive Research One universities like UC Davis than at a lot of other institutions that may appear more attractive or cheaper or closer to home, but some of those places actually have pretty bad graduation rates for all groups and especially for underrepresented. What do you guys want to?
Looking at serving the middle class versus the lower income and the disproportionate disadvantage. When I went to the Capitol to talk with the Senate Education Committee principal consultant, and she told us that there were several bills last year involving Cal grants and just different financial aid programs and such, and there were two programs that would have expanded Cal Grant B access, AB 1285 and 1287, that would have either allowed students who became ineligible for financial aid to become, it explained the terms by which they can become eligible again, and it also eliminated the 2% limit on the number of Cal Grant B qualifiers who can get aid in their first year. So that would have cost a lot of money because you need to either reserve money or just have more money available sooner. But both of those died in appropriations where they decide where a bill has enough money to happen. According to the Senate Education Committee, because the Middle Class Scholarship Fund, which is basically a kind of a grant program for people for students coming from families who make between $80,000 and $150,000, and that is apparently the range that defines middle income, which is frightening and not practical for me. But because the money went to students making between $80,000 and $150,000, and that was put into the budget, that money couldn't go to reinforcing Cal Grant B, which goes to much lower income. So I'm not saying that's like the root of all evil here, but like that's symbolic of I think what you're talking about is that the priorities and the opportunity costs involved with funding one group over another is often seeks to advantage people of higher income.
The provost in his comments made said that since the events in 2011, he has done a lot to alleviate the burden on the students. And based on her comments and what many other students say, that they have to make a choice between paying the tuition or buying nutritious food, would the provost have to say what improvements have been made?
Would you like to say?
Sure, thank you for this, but I'm really not a member of the panel, so this will be the only question I answer. But on that front, one of the things that we've done is the Blue and Gold, of course, is a UC-wide program. What we at Davis have done in advance of the middle class scholarships that I know the legislature is looking at, we this past year launched a a funding program, a scholarship program for the group, $80,000 to $120,000 group. So that's one thing that we've tried to do. I would say that our commitment to not only studying, but also working to keep accessibility and affordability possible. I absolutely understand the stories that we've heard here, and these are realities. But one of the things that's just simply amazing about the University of California, even today, so far from the ideal of the master plan, is the degree of students who come from relatively lower family incomes, as the 43% Pell Grant participation rate at UC Davis shows, is testimony to the fact that there really still is no other system that is a machine for transformation that UC is. So it's very far from the ideal, but it's still an astonishing achievement today. And I wonder if I could use the fact that I have the microphone for a moment to ask a question. I'll give it up. Is that, it's your microphone. I'll give it back to you. But just, my dream would absolutely be that we could return to the vision of 1960 and have the state fund tuition. So I'm wondering, maybe I would start with Felicia, because you brought it up, is what do you think we could tell the taxpayers of the state of California that would convince them, once again, to agree to pay taxes sufficient to allow the state to keep up with that commitment it made in the master plan, which of course also talked about the state giving that support?
I think one thing that I would have to say on that is it's a return on investment. I mean, obviously, according to Professor Stevens' findings, UC Davis students that graduate obviously pay off their loans over a period of time, and we end up joining the workforce and being able to give back to not just the California community, but the greater community, the nation, the world. And I think that's really important for taxpayers to know, because we can continue on, and let's say 20 years from now, not many people try to come into higher education because it's just not affordable or accessible. Then we have, I don't know how many thousands of these students not coming to UC Davis, instead directly entering the workforce, not as intelligent or well-equipped as they would have been from this investment on education, whether it be loans, whether it be through taxes. We need to get ourselves through this four-year education somehow. And I think that is something really important to consider. I do know that at the Regents meeting today, the California Master Plan was brought up and is being reconsidered. So it's something that's in current use, and I really urge people to look into it, educate yourselves about it, and kind of take the steps necessary to push that through. Thank you.
Oh, and to continue on the, fiscal argument there, let me just put forth as a disclaimer, I'm speaking on behalf of myself, not ASUCD or Lobby Corps. We need to legalize marijuana. We need to end the drug war. We need to repeal the Three Strikes Law. We need to pass the oil severance tax. Okay.
And I also would like to highlight that we live in a state where we spend more money to keep people in prison than we do to put people through school. So that would be my number one thing to say to a taxpayer, is that you are doing more to keep somebody imprisoned or to keep a system going than you are investing in your neighbor's children's education, your children's education, your future grandchildren's education. And I think that that's something that's really real, and that's something that's really tangible, because we have one of the highest levels of corrections in our state, and as compared to other states and other countries. And it's really sad to see where students are battling with a system that doesn't necessarily invest in them the way that they should.
Are there any forces or bills in politics right now that are trying to get higher education or education in general funding as part of the budget instead of a leftover, here's what we have left? Because that seems like a...
Contingent upon not raising tuition, the UC and CSU system received $142.2 million additional dollars in the upcoming budget.
If the master plan is put into effect and there is no more no more tuition for in-state students. What does that mean for out-of-state students? Would the costs be the same, or would they be so high that no out-of-state student would honestly consider coming?
Who wants to take
I,
Sure.
I wish I had the answer to that question. I mean, according to my understanding, the goal of the California Master Plan was to get California invested in its future leaders into education. Kind of the goal was so that if you can't go directly to a UC, you as California students could go through a community college, through a CSU if you have to, like a three-pronged step to hit the UC education. But I mean, in terms of my understanding is that if they were to use taxpayers' money for the California to pay off your tuition, it wouldn't really affect out of state because they'd be paying normally, but don't quote me on that because that's just my understanding.
The other thing on that is that the way we're making tuition free, like, you know, by the logic and abstraction of the master plan, is that people that have been paying California state taxes have been paying into this system. So by that kind of fiscal philosophy, there would be expected a certain amount of tuition from out of state. However, that is still balanced with the use of out-of-state universities, out-of-state students as incentive to then move to California or to, you know, be a part of the California economy or so forth. So that's the balancing act between you didn't pay California state taxes your whole life, or your family didn't, so, and you didn't pay into the system. However, we still want you to come here. So that's the balancing act. I think he's had his here.
Frank Hertz from Community Development. First of all, compliments to this wonderful articulate panel and the research you do, and for Provost Textor to have a resort on that. But let me give you some observations that I have from the perspective of a community developer. I think the system we have in this state, the system, because it works. It is not dysfunctional. It works. But for whom does it work? The second question then would be,
Okay, try this way. Why aren't arguments used, which are all fine, very well and very well taken, why are they not heard? So if you are right that education is an investment, and an investment that is so unequally distributed, with so unequal consequences, how come, can you retreat back to the thinking that the lawmakers are just a bunch of people who don't get it? Or is there something else at work that continues to have a policy decisions organized this way? Third issue would be to talk about is the state of California at this very moment not rich enough to afford a university or sort of an education as is, independent of what I think about Mariana policies or about imprisonment policies, is the amount of taxes collected right now, again, independent of how absolutely utterly outrageous I find the tax system, but as it is, would it be enough? So why is it not distributed? And why are the decisions not made? The last point I would like to do is I want to talk as a professor. What are the consequences for someone like me who has to teach students like the four of you? What am I grading? Am I grading only the outcome at the end of the test? Or am I grading who had access to free time and all the other resources to prepare for a class? So do I not continue a discrimination that has turned much earlier, but in my grading processes, in the way in which I educate, do I continue to discriminate a program that, in fact, the university I'm working for tries to overcome? So put differently, the four of you, one of the lucky four we can hear, what do we know about all those who are not any longer here, who cannot come because of the system in which I have to deliver fair grades to those who can in fact prepare and work for their studies?
Alrighty. Okay, so looking at this from a fiscal point of view, I don't have the numbers or, you know, the exact budget or the tax revenue or expenditures to exactly comment on that because I'm not the treasurer. What I can say is that even though I don't know how, the budget numbers or even general numbers. I do know that the evolving philosophy that has persisted since 1960 has been one that has distracted from the priority of higher education through divestment. I mean, even over the last 10 years, the number we saw in the beginning, how we had $15,000 spent per student in 2001, and now $6,700 now. This has been a process of divestment, whether by economic hardship or by other expenditures we have sought to make instead of higher education. So whether or not there is enough, the tax base is there, I don't know, but the mindset is changeable because the mindset used to exist otherwise. Okay, so that's that aspect.
Just to contradict that very point, people would not be re-elected if it wouldn't make sense to make this decision. And I'm not condoning this that you only have to pay, that they only pay $6,700.
Most of these were.
But people are re-elected because of the policies they execute, and not because they would like to harm students.
Many of these things that I mentioned before are actually voter initiatives. Prop 13, Prop 209, Prop 98 were all voted by the people. So it has been, in fact, a distraction of, yes, in fact, the popular incentive otherwise. And we are seeing the result of that popular distraction in our inequitable, flawed, high stakes, higher education. So yes, it's not simply a matter of, I don't operate politically on the idea of that the legislators are just a bunch of, buffoons. That's my federal opinion, but yeah, at least in terms of like how it works, how just policy works, there's a lot of other aspects involved, and it does have to do with culture and social movements. However, as we see the results of those priorities, we can thus remedy them. Okay, and then with the teaching part,
I can touch on that.
You take that.
I'll talk a little bit about, in terms of from the professor's point of view. I mean, I hope that my professors aren't discriminating just because, they may think that I have to work another job, therefore you should grade a little easier on me. I mean, I think I came to this university for the same quality education that everyone else came here for.
Sorry, I didn't mean this. I'm not consciously discriminating. I discriminate whether I like it or not by giving everybody the same grade for the same work, but people do have different conditions under which they achieve the result. If you have a preparation of 2 hours, for example, somebody else has a preparation of 4 hours, the person with 2 hours likely gets a lower grade. Everything else being equal. So this is what I mean. So the discrimination is not one that is personally, but that is structurally.
And I mean, I think this goes back to what one of my fellow panelists said, that it's kind of an investment. Do you look at this as, I have to somehow find $3,000, should I take on another job, or should I take a risk and kind of trust myself and take out a $3,000 loan? I have friends, for example, who've decided work is more important than school, and they've worked, 4 jobs, and they drop out of college after they're on academic probation and realize, maybe a loan should have been the smartest idea. So it's really up to, I think, the individual student and kind of how we prioritize. I hope that this isn't a burden to professors at all. I really think that, we're responsible enough to get ourselves here. It should be up to us students whether or not we decide to take on, multiple jobs, 1 job, or multiple loans. And, sometimes it's not our fault, and I can't completely blame the university. It's just the decision that we have to make. Thank you.
I wanted to speak to the last couple of comments just briefly. So the previous comment, and several times we've referred to going back to 1960 and the master plan, and then we talk about, well, why aren't political arguments resonating today for university support? And when I think about those things together, I first want to say, well, a lot has changed economically, demographically, socially since 1960, and perhaps we want to think a bit about how the vision and the master plan from that decade might need to evolve. But the other thing that so those changes are the topic of several other seminars, I think. But the other thing that I think has changed since 1960, and here I feel like following my colleague and saying These are not the views of the Department of Economics or the Center for Poverty Research. But I will say, I think one major thing that's changed since 1960 is that in 1960 there was not this pervasive, often repeated belief that government programs can do no good. And I think as a public university, there's this kind of umbrella argument that is being made that we have to fight and address, which is that if you're going to argue that a public education is associated with a public or even a private good, we're at a point where that argument actually has to be articulated over and over. And I think that wasn't the case in 1960 or 1970. So that's a very broad response, but just something to put out there.
Your question?
Kind of going off of Frank Hurst's comments, I kind of wanted to ask, from the standpoint of how he was saying, like, as a professor, he's basically unintentionally discriminating and taking it into the realm of just like specifically like performance and the resources given to students. Like, for an example, one student can come from a very high-performing high school where they were given the necessary resources that they needed to come here and stay and perform very well and graduate on time. Whereas another student can come from a high school that isn't very high-performing, they don't really have good instructors, and they aren't prepared, but still the university gives them that extra little bump during like application process, taking into account that their school wasn't as good. But when they get here, my question to you is what kind of resources, because how they perform does impact their financial support that they get from the university. What support do you think that the university can provide these people with? Because they only have 4 years to try and catch up, maybe 5 or 6, versus the 12 years that these other students have had in order for them to really be able to perform well at this university. So what resources here on campus do you think that the university can provide to try and fill that very large gap?
It's a great question.
I would like to start answering this question with the fact that I believe that there's not a lot of major specific tutoring on campus. And if you're coming from a public high school in California, Star is right, there is a large disparity between the quality of education and the subject matter that's covered at different schools. So you do see a lot of people who come here and try to get into certain majors, and they've never dealt with the material on this level, and they're not accustomed to the pace of the quarter system, and they just fall through the cracks and they fall out of the university. So I think that that's one of the number one things that we can do is to get a lot of tutoring and a lot of support for students to kind of adapt to this really fast-paced academic schedule we have. Because I know like a lot of the high schools we have are coming from semester systems. And it's just really hard to expect a student to operate on the semester system their entire life and come here and condense it down into 10 weeks at something that they haven't really dealt with ever in high school, in middle school, and elementary school. I didn't take any engineering classes in high school, so I could just imagine the rigor that they experience when they come here.
Do you want to talk? I just wanted to say a little something. I did hear from a student who had that similar experience and dropped out of college and then just came back to Davis. And one thing that I think is important, similar to specific major tutoring, for example, my freshman year, everyone on my floor, took chemistry or maths, 17A, whatever it was. There were tutors for that, but for someone like me, where I was a political science major, like I actually there was writing help, but there wasn't any help specifically on my field of study. My other concern is that, we do have resources on campus, but they aren't widely known. I just found out that the Student Academic Success Center has workshops on, how to take multiple choice tests, which is like one of my, biggest weaknesses. And I just realized this, third year coming in here, and I should be going to these before my next midterm, and the fact that I found out 3 years a little too late is concerning to me, because I know that our university has resources, maybe not enough resources, but they're there, and not many people know about them.
Yeah. If we were going to go into the inequity in the K-12 system, we would need another forum that I would like to talk to. Anyway, only if we could somehow have an agency that could collaborate between the segments involved and the California Department of Education to figure out what our schools are actually teaching. This comes down to collaboration because gets back to the ultimate narrative or the ultimate dialectic between what the institutions want and what the public needs. And institutions, even in like the 1973 report, it says institutions are, the quality of institutions is measured by the quality of its students. And institutions want to love being more selective and being more prestigious in that sense. However, when that trend and that ambition is not reflective of what's happening in K-12, then we have a major discrepancy in which we have the college retention problems that we do. So how do we address that? We address that by figuring out what exactly our K-12 system needs, by doing what K-12 should be doing, but that's a whole nother discussion. But we need this institution, the segments, and California higher education to be responsive to the environment that its students are coming from.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have to end it there, but thank you everyone for coming out. Thank you to our panelists for coming. And thank you to Professor Enschultz for sharing all of her hard work and research in this. It's really been great to have you here as well. So thank you again for coming. This was a great discussion. We do have refreshments in the back. There's water, lemonade, pizza. So grab something to eat. If you didn't get to ask a question, I'm sure our panelists would be happy to talk to you. So have a great night. Thank you so much.